Hey everybody, hanging out here with a Midas M32 digital console talking about some tips and tricks to help you improve your workflow. Anything we talk about on an M32 of course would apply to any Midas M series or Behringer X series digital consoles. But really today's topic is EQ, so this kind of applies to any console. We get a lot of questions about EQ, and I kind of want to demystify it. EQ really does not need to be difficult, and in fact, you should not be overusing EQ. It is a simple tool that we want to use to fix small issues, but if we EQ things too far, you can end up throwing a signal further out of phase than it ever was before you started EQing. That's a discussion for a much heavier topic, but to put it simply, you want to use EQ sparingly. There's a couple of tips and tricks that you want to keep in mind when you're EQing a signal. All right? The first one, that is probably the most important, is it is always better to cut than it is to boost. Again, this has to do with the phase of the signal, and boosting in EQ has a more extreme end result on the signal than cutting in EQ. There's more mathematics that apply to all of that, but it's just a simple thing. The other thing is you want your EQ to be musical and minimal. And so if you're finding that you have to do a lot of extreme EQ on an input channel to get what you believe is a good sound, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board and actually have your entire sound system optimized and retuned. That's something a professional company such as ourselves could do for you, and we highly recommend getting it done at least once a year just to help clean up any of the things going on in your room. So when you are EQing, you have a few tools available to you. So I've got a microphone here on input 1. And we're just going to do a couple of simple things. First of all, I'm going to route that to my mains so that we're getting some signal. And I'm going to jump over to my preamp section first. You'll notice that in the preamp section there is a high-pass filter. And you can adjust that from the section, but it's actually more visually easy to see what it's doing on the EQ section. So I'm going to go to my EQ view button. I'm going to turn my high-pass filter on, and as I start bringing it up, you'll notice that this curve is showing up, this cut. And as I start bringing it up, the microphone gets thinner and thinner. Obviously, we wouldn't want this much high pass on a microphone. You can already hear how much phase it's thrown this input signal out. Doesn't sound good. And so when setting a high pass filter, you don't want to set it too high, even on a vocal. You want to make sure that you're just getting a very musical sound. Maybe it's taking out a little bit of that excess that you don't need. But if you go too far, you're going to kill the signal. So use your ears to find right where that high pass filter should be. Okay? Then on most boards, you're going to have a low shelf or a low EQ, a few middle EQs that are parametric, and then a high shelf or high EQ. On the M32, we have 4 of those. So we have a specific low band, we have a specific high band, and then 2 specific mid bands. All 4 of these can operate as parametric EQ, which is pretty cool. So since I already have a high pass filter, my low one doesn't need to be, but just so you know, you can make it one by using the select button over here and selecting low cut, which would basically act like a high pass filter, or low shelf, which gives you more of a shelving duck instead of a cut. And then of course you have PEQ, VEQ, and basically PEQ and VEQ on the Midas and X32 consoles are just variations of how this Q knob works. So I'm just going to show you how one of these works. I guess a common adjustment that we do find in vocal mics is a low mid. So if I select my low mid here, and just for fun I'm going to turn it up, turn my EQ on here, turn it up, and we're going to start hearing some frequencies kind of poke out. And of course, that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. By turning it up, you hear an immediate and extreme change. And so I'm just doing that to show you. I normally wouldn't actually boost anything like that. In fact, what I might do is cut a little. So this knob adjusts my gain, so I can see that I'm applying a little bit of cut. This knob adjusts the frequency, so as I cut different frequencies, we hear the phase of the signal change, and that's usually what I'm trying to correct, is maybe something feels a little extreme. And then you have this thing called a Q knob, which adjusts the width of that. So if I make a really extreme adjustment here, change that Q knob, you'll notice that I get a really narrow EQ or a really wide EQ. And this brings another good tip and trick up. Generally, it's better to use very shallow, which means I'm only cutting a few dB, and fairly wide EQs. Again, then you're not throwing such extreme changes into the input signal. So if I were adjusting maybe a mic that felt a little boomy, I might just do a slight cut in whatever area sounds right to me, and then adjust the cue to where I feel like it's changing the signal where I needed it to, but it's not destroying the signal. So you always have those options available on all of those. Just a note, on your low and your high, you have extra options available. So I'm going to boost my high a little bit. You'll see it's acting like a normal EQ, but if I switch this over, this is called a high shelf. So you see how it shelves up and then stays. And of course we can do that cutting signal too. Makes a huge change, kind of makes it very muffly. So not usually something I want to do too much of. Or like my high pass filter, I can create a low pass filter by selecting this high cut, and then you'll notice how I lose my cue control. I don't have cue control anymore. I don't have gain control. All I have is frequency. So as I tone that down, just totally destroys the signal. And hopefully that shows you how extreme EQ can be. You really want to be careful with EQ. Only use it as a tool to help bring your instrument or input back into phase plane with the system. If you're having to do extreme EQs, then you probably want to have your system looked at. In any case, always use your ears, make small adjustments, and listen critically to see if it's making the desirable change that you want it to. If it's not, go ahead and set your EQ back to flat and start from scratch again. A lot of times you'll find you can solve problems pretty easily by just eliminating too much EQ.